Brut, New Art on Stage.
Welcome to the third podcast of The Art of Assembly, a series produced by Brut Theater in Vienna in collaboration with Wiener Festwochen and Münchner Kammerspiele. My name is Florian Malzacher. I'm a performing arts curator, dramaturg and writer, and the host of this series of talks. This podcast is based on a live online conversation on March 20th, 2021. In The Art of Assembly, we try to investigate the role, but also the potential of assemblies in politics, activism, and art, marking the 10th anniversary of the square movements that spread all over the planet, beginning with the social protests in Tunisia and Egypt, and continuing in Europe, the Americas, Africa, Asia till today. By the way, if you're joining us for the first time, you might want to have a look at our website where you find the lectures of the past editions, as well as a lot of links, videos, material, etc. related to our topics. In our last edition, together with the art historian Julia Ramirez Blanco and the filmmaker Oliver Ressler, we took a close look at the role of assemblies in different social movements, like Occupy Wall Street and 15M in Spain, but also within current struggles, and how they function and how they can be part of imagining radical forms of democracy. Today, we zoom out again and take a quite different angle. The title Assemblism of today's session comes from the use of the artist Jonas Staal, who appropriates it from Judith Butler and Athena Athanasiou. For Jonas, Assemblism describes the role that art, performance, and theater can play in the assemblies of mass protests, something that very much also informs his own work. Political theorist Jodi Dean has a more critical view on these assemblies. For Dean, the main focus lies in the question if they're actually able to be translated into more sustainable forms, which for her means into a new communist party. But she also criticizes the focus on the form, on the event of the assembly itself, which Staal, together with Butler, claims to be performative. And not only then, this claim is actually something that plays a strong role also for this series of talks. For example, when you listen to our last episode. So tonight we will first, with a talk by Jonas Staal, have a look at the potential of art in not only investigating or inventing new forms of assembly, but also in contributing to the process of transforming them into sustainable organizational structures. After that, Jodi Dean will take a close look at recent political mobilizations from quite opposing sides of the political spectrum. And she will raise the question if the notion of precarity is actually helpful when it comes to define political movements. Jonas Staal is a visual artist whose work deals with the relation between art, propaganda, and democracy. Assemblies play an important role in his work that I personally first encountered with his New World Summit at the Berlin Biennial in 2012. For me, Jonas' work has long been among the most consequent artistic approaches to not only observe, criticize, or represent politics, but to really intervene and to understand art also as a tool for social change. And as a disclaimer, I should mention that we also collaborated on a couple of projects, most recently on the ongoing program Training for the Future. And I should mention his recent book, Propaganda Art in the 21st Century, published with MIT Press in 2019. Jonas is joining us from Athens. The floor is all yours.
Thank you so much, Florian, for the invitation and for the introduction, and to everyone at Brut for hosting us. And of course, it's an honor to share the platform tonight with Jodi Dean, whose work has influenced my own practice in many, many ways. So as Florian said, much of my artistic practice builds on the imaginaries that emerge through popular mass movements and their struggle for new egalitarian forms of life. And to describe this process, I use the term assemblism. And I want to show you a slide, but for some reason that is not happening. And I don't know why. Here you go. And so to describe this process, I use the term assemblism that derives from the work, as Florian already mentioned, of Athena Athanasiou and Judith Butler on performative assembly in their book, dispossession, the performative in the political in 2013, which was also the foundation for Butler's subsequent work towards a performative theory of assembly from 2015. Now, Afanasiou and Butler describe how shared experiences of precarity bring people to seek one another on streets and squares or through coordinated hunger strikes in the prison industrial complex. And although at such moments we bodily gather or coordinate unchosen, pressured by the forces of dispossession, in the process of assembly, we do not merely oppose the powers that be, but we begin to prefigure, to perform its possible alternatives. And in this regard, Butler writes, a social movement is itself a social form. And when a social movement calls for a new way of life, a form of livable life, then it must at that moment enact the very principles it seeks to realize. This means that when it works, there is a performative enactment of radical democracy in such movement that alone can articulate what it might mean to lead a good life in the sense of a livable life. These new prefigurative social forms manifest as general assemblies, alternative media channels, self-organized healthcare infrastructures, and open source libraries. Now, while the practice of performative assembly cannot and should not be understood in purely artistic terms, Butler references terminology that emphasizes the role that art plays within performative assembly. So, for example, she discusses the assembly as an assemblage. She speaks of the theatrical dimension of the assembly and the visual morphology of its social forms. I use the term assemblism to refer specifically to these artistic components of performative assembly. An artistic practice in that sense can be described as assemblist when it acts in performative assembly to contribute to the shaping the morphologies of its social forms. Now here it's also important to name the conflictuous nature of performative assembly as well as its limitations. The Yellow Vest movement in France, for example, shows that performative assembly does not by definition prefigure emancipatory politics. This movement, the Yellow Vests, consisted both of reactionary forces linked to parties like the racist Rassemblement National of Marine Le Pen, as well as progressive forces related, amongst others, to the French labor movements, to the Kurdish French militants, and others. So the site of performative assembly is thus also a site of struggle. It's a site of struggle over which social forms are to persist and construct reality differently. Here, Jodi Dean's book, Crowds and Party, is essential, I believe, as she describes the need to canalize the egalitarian potential and energies of the crowd, the performative assembly, through the party form. She warns not to fetishize the initial moment of assembly and protest as a goal in and of itself, because when these energies are not acted upon organizationally, it risks exhaustion of social movements, disillusionment about the impossibility of change, and capture of emancipatory transformative momentum by authoritarian parties and regimes. In her words, it sometimes seems as if people on the left love revolution but hate the party. We enthusiastically support transformation, especially personal transformation, yet in the same breath we scoff at institutionalized practices strategically oriented towards the pursuit of radical political change. Many of us thus reject the organizational form that marks the difference between the chaos of revolution and the building of a new political and social order. With this rejection, we shield ourselves from a confrontation with the real of division, luxuriating instead in the fantasy of the beautiful moment. And here we can just think of the 2011 15M Los Indignados movements that emerged in Spain, Catalonia, and other regions. Had organizers not worked tirelessly to translate its prefigurative social forms into a party form, Podemos, which entered into a left coalition just before the coronavirus pandemic, then private healthcare infrastructures would not have been nationalized and a project for universal basic income would never have come off the ground. From an artistic point of view, this is where we move from assemblist art practice that is focused on the prefigurative social form to organizational art practice that focuses on the organizational and the infrastructural form. So whereas assemblist art practice operates within performative assembly, organizational art practice translates the egalitarian discharge of the crowd into durational infrastructures and alternative emancipatory institutional forms. Now, as Florian already mentioned, Dean emphasizes the need not for any party, but for a communist party to ensure egalitarian life forms to structure our shared realities. That still leaves the questions about the form, the morphology of a 21st century communist party. And here I believe organizational art comes into play to push the prefiguration from the squares towards institutions for emancipatory self-governance and collective ownership. In that light, I now want to discuss some examples of my own practice on the intersection of assemblist and organizational art practice that will focus on the form of the stateless parliament, collectivized trillion-dollar companies, and the experimental proletarian biosphere. I will start by discussing my artistic and political organization New World Summit, a series of alternative parliaments for stateless and blacklisted organizations that I created with my team in theaters, art institutions, and public spaces since 2012. This organizational art project emerged in response to the ongoing war on terror, to challenge the us versus them master narrative. Is it possible, we asked, that politicized civil society that opposes the war has more in common with the organizations persecuted in the war than with the criminal terrorist states that claim to speak and act in our name? In the alternative parliaments of the New World Summit, we aim to reassemble, to recompose who or what is to be defined as us in the us versus them dichotomy. In our work, this process is led by representatives of stateless and blacklisted organizations that stem from long histories of anti-colonial, liberational, and socialist struggle. Rather than following the war on terror narrative that terrorists are somehow driven by an innate hatred of democracy, we instead contrasted the capitalist imperialist democracy underlying the war on terror with communalist, collectivist, and stateless democracies. The morphologies of the alternative parliaments play an important role in this process of recomposing collectivities. Our parliaments double in form, breaking with the pre-existing hierarchies in liberal assembly, enabling bodily intimacy with political representatives speaking from within rather than to the crowd. The chair in traditional parliaments, the chair to sit on, not the chair that leads the proceedings, the chair in traditional parliaments, which breaks the possibility of the collective into individualized sovereign representatives, is rejected in favor of the communalist dynamic of the bench. In other words, we aim to translate with the New World Summit emancipatory ideology into emancipatory form and contribute through emancipatory form to the furthering of emancipatory ideology and its practice. Organizing the New World Summit also led to more intimate collaborations, amongst others with the autonomous Rojava government in northern Syria, in West Kurdistan, that invited us to develop a new public parliament for its stateless democracy, a political model based on local self-governance, gender equality, and communal economy. The parliament we created is shaped as a public space, and as such rejects the separation between the people and the governing class. Its circular form emphasizes collective representation and collective ownership, surrounded by pillars on which key terms from the Rojavan social contract are represented as a spatial manifesto. The parliament translates revolutionary ideology into a spatial form, but that's not the end point, because it simultaneously operates as an arena where these ideas are furthered and further propagated in practice. In this context, the notion of statelessness, in the Rojava's model of stateless democracy, it no longer stands for a position of radical precarity or powerlessness. It stands as a precondition. Statelessness is a precondition for liberation from the patriarchal, nationalist, and capitalist capture of the state. It is, in that sense, a proposition of a 21st century withering away of the state. Now allow me to share a second example from my practice in which, similar to the New World Summit, assemblist art practice and organizational art practice intersect. And this concerns the collective action lawsuits Collectivize Facebook that I initiated together with human rights lawyer Jan Vermon. In our indictment, in the indictment that we have drafted against Facebook, which we will be submitting to the United Nations Human Rights Court in Geneva, we argue that Facebook infringes upon the right to self-determination of peoples and individuals in various ways. The corporation instrumentalizes users as neo-feudal data workers. It extracts our data, and that essentially constitutes Facebook's profit model, but we are not remunerated for this. Facebook employs racist algorithms in its targeted advertisement campaigns and campaign possibilities. It's used in various surveillance capacities that infringe upon privacy and further impacts democratic elections in disproportionate ways, of which data capture and targeted campaigns of Cambridge Analytica have been a recent and most well-known example. And the corporation has willfully advised authoritarian regimes, such as that of Duterte in the Philippines. As a result, Vermon and me argue that the very structure of ownership of Facebook is what essentially undermines our individual and collective right to self-determination. And therefore, our demand is to have Facebook recognized, first of all, as a public domain, and second, to consequently transfer its ownership to the 2.3 billion Facebook users active on the platform today. As unpaid data workers, we worked for it. We worked for Facebook. Now we must own it. It's time to socialize so-called social media. Now, to clarify, to collectivize Facebook does not mean to reform Facebook, neither does it mean to nationalize Facebook. We aim to turn trillion-dollar companies, of which Facebook is one of them. We can also think of companies like Amazon or Bayer that owns Monsanto, Alphabet that owns Google. We aim to turn trillion-dollar companies into new models of transnational cooperatives, collectively owned and governed by their users. This is, following the Roosevelt practice of stateless democracy, a potential pathway to create transnational unions beyond the corporation and beyond the state. In these past months, Vermon and I have organized various pre-trials, preliminary tribunals, to introduce our indictment and invite publics to join our case as co-claimants, but also to invite witnesses to witness the future that becomes possible if we win the case. So we do not ask witnesses to witness to confirm the legal argumentation of our indictment. We ask them to witness the future that becomes possible when we win through our indictment. Witnessing the future is an essential part of our case, of our collective action lawsuit, because while our indictment aims to provide a legal framework to reclaim common ownership over trillion-dollar companies, that still leaves open the question how we would govern these collectively as transnational cooperatives. What would be the decision-making structure for 2.3 billion co-owners of Facebook? Do we ban advertisements? Do we ensure encryption? Do we decentralize servers or even dismantle its infrastructure as a whole, considering its heavy reliance on extractive industries? And for anyone that is listening and that shares our argumentation, we invite you to read the full indictment and join as co-claimant at collectivize.org, so that when we file our indictment, we will be in the thousands, in the tens of thousands, in the hundreds of thousands to make a collective case for collectivization. Now, of course, the model of the collective action lawsuit against Facebook and other trillion-dollar companies cannot succeed without broad alliance with popular mass movements and precarious workers. For this reason, we are also involved with the global Make Amazon Pay campaign, for which we developed a visual morphology that you can see here. And for those who are not familiar with the campaign, on Black Friday, November 27, 2020, it was this campaign, coordinated by Uni Global Union and Progressive International, that organized parallel strikes, demonstrations, and projections at Amazon warehouses across the world, in India, Bangladesh, Australia, Brazil, Mexico, various European countries, and the United States, including at CEO Jeff Bezos, his mansion that you can see here. It is very important to remind them that we know where they live, but also that we know that corporations, and that a corporation is not a person, and that we are able to identify the people responsible for the structural precarity and extraction of our labor, of our natural resources, to hold them to account. The visual morphology of the Make Amazon Pay campaign consists, as you can see, of a doubling of the Amazon icon. That can be read both as a smile beneath the word Amazon, but also as a forward arrow. So doubling this arrow, doubling the smile, placed on a red canvas, emphasizes the demand to return, following the manifesto that was published by the coalition of different organizations and unions that supported the campaign. It means return rights to Amazon workers. It means return their labor by providing fair income, social security, the right to unionize, return the environmental costs of carbon excess, return profits made through tax avoidance. Simultaneously, hijacking and socializing the Amazon visual identity also aims for a first step towards replacement. It's not just a process, it's a projection of an Amazon that could be opening a visual portal towards a future that is a future Amazon that is owned and governed by its workers and users. In other words, a collectivized Amazon. Now, Jodi Dean, in her latest book, Comrade, from 2019, speaks of a collective desire for collectivity that underlies the party form and the political relationship embodied by the term comrade, that affirms discipline in common struggle, and that affirms a struggle on the same side. The final example that I want to share with you on the intersection of assemblist and organizational art practice relates to an expansion of precisely this notion of comradeship, and it concerns a project titled Interplanetary Species Society that responds to the current endeavors to turn humans into an interplanetary species by building settlements on the red planet, certainly our planet, Mars. One of the most prominent actors in the endeavor to turn humans into an interplanetary species is, of course, the organization SpaceX, founded by Elon Musk, but we can also think of Jeff Bezos, his own Moon Express, that aim to terraform Mars as a backup planet. Quote from Musk: terraform Mars as a backup planet in case of environmental disaster or nuclear catastrophe on Earth. Apart from the deep cynicism of sending workers to terraform a backup planet for the 0.1%, it is important to consider the vocabulary used by organizations like SpaceX, which shamefully replicate colonial language by declaring a new generation of pioneers and the Mars colony. Interplanetary Species Society, that you can see here, takes the form of an alternative experimental biosphere and instead calls for humans to think of ourselves as guests rather than pioneers, to engage in interplanetary cooperation rather than colonization, and most of all, to engage our thinking of interplanetarism into a form of intraplanetarism, meaning a deepening of our role in comradely bonds within ecologies that sustain us on Earth. This project, this alternative biosphere, was located in the Reaktorhallen, a former underground nuclear facility in Stockholm, and it seemed relevant to me that building the facility underground originally was once intended to protect the surface from radiation, while in the course of the unfolding climate collapse, it is us that will be forced underground, deeper within Earth, intraplanetary, to protect ourselves from the radiation of the surface. Now, our biosphere gathered humans with neo-constructivist ammonites, proletarian plants, and meteorites to enable a form of assembly not only with the ecologies of our present, but also with those of the deep past. The neo-constructivist ammonites, for example, that you can see here, are fossils of ammonites, a family of octopus and squid that lived between 300 and 66 million years ago and that perished in the fifth mass extinction. Now, it might seem that human life and ammonite life is vastly different in terms of our experience of lived time, our organic composition. But the ammonites are witnesses of the fifth mass extinction, just as we are witnessing the sixth. They are fossils, and we are fossils in the making. Further, the ammonite is literally the fossil in fossil fuel, millions of years of aggregated, decomposed bodies of animals and plants that racial capitalism burns to accelerate the present and undo the possibility of a future in which humans can survive in a meaningful way. Of course, the constructivist bodies and slogans of the ammonites refer to the work of the constructivist and productivist artists in the Russian Revolution. And this might seem paradoxical, as these artists embraced the industrial paradigm that structured their work. But artists such as Popova, Stepanova, and Rodchenko also developed a theory of the object as comrade, meaning that in revolution, commodities would not just become collective property, but revolutionary agents in their own rights, comrades. In interplanetary species society, this idea is expanded into the political recognition of the non-human comrade, with whom we share an ecology from deep past to the present, and with whom we share an urgent struggle to ensure deep futures and the biosphere for all. Now, in conclusion, it seems relevant to mention the cultural wing of the Progressive International, the partner in the Make Amazon Pay campaign, the cultural wing of the Progressive International that was launched yesterday under the name Art of Internationalism. The dozens of artists, cultural workers, collectives, and theorists that joined the platform from across the world, to me shows a common understanding that our imaginative competences must go hand in hand with emancipatory political work through a new transnational party form. As we are faced with planetary crisis in the form of neo-fascist regimes, global precarization, structural racism, and ecosystem collapse, our collective desire for collectivity desires structural organization at scale. From an artistic perspective, that means moving from assemblist practice to organizational ones to ensure the transformation of artistic egalitarian imaginations into political reality. And with that, I hand the floor back to Florian. Thank you for listening.
Thank you, Jonas. A lot to talk about. But first, I'm very happy to introduce Jodi Dean, because you're a crucial thinker for the topic we're circling around. And not only this, I already mentioned you're also a clear voice when it comes to challenge the notion of assembly and to stress the danger of romanticizing it. Your writing is always concerned with the question of how to build alliances, how to unite in the struggle at hand, rather than being atomized in numerous subgroups. And for this, it needs, in your view, a, quote, communist horizon, as also one of your books is called. In Crowds and Party, the book that is maybe most important in the context of the series, you argue that Occupy Wall Street and many other movements at the end were limiting themselves by falling into the trap of individualism, a trap that is actually set up by capitalism. For a sustainable movement, it is important to focus on common goals and to build structures. It needs, in your view, a new communist party. This line you also follow in your latest book, where you plead for the figure of the comrade. And this is also the title of the book, rather than, for example, for the figure of the ally, which is very popular at the moment. I hope we have time to get a bit into this later on, but now I hand over to you. Jodi Dean is a professor of political science at Hobart and William Smith College in Geneva, New York, from where she's also joining us. And your lecture has the telling title, Which Side is the Freedom Side?
Thanks so much. I'm really happy to be part of this. Thanks for the invitation, Florian. And it was great to hear Jonas's presentation. I was fortunate enough to be part of one of his New World Summits. And so it's great to hear about the shift from assemblist art practice to organizational art practice. I think in some ways my comments are more part of a way of drawing out the need for this organizational shift. And so there's some kind of criticisms of the focus just on precarity, but maybe we can take up some of those in the discussion. A prominent chant in the demonstrations against racist policing that erupted last summer in the wake of the murder of George Floyd was the song, "Which Side Are You On?" Made famous by Pete Seeger. The song was written in 1931 by Florence Reese, the wife of an organizer with United Mine Workers based in Harlan County, Kentucky. In the 1960s, "Which Side Are You On?" was taken up in the civil rights movement. In 2014, it was sung in protest against the police murder of Michael Brown in Ferguson, Missouri. In September 2020, demonstrators in Rochester, New York, sang it in marches protesting the police murder of Daniel Prude. Singers call, "Which side are you on, my people? Which side are you on?" The response, "We're on the freedom side." And I begin with this history because I want to engage some recent thinking about assemblies, collectivity, and politics, particularly from Judith Butler and Jonas Staal. My general question concerns the usefulness of their emphases on precarity and assembly in analyzing mass political mobilizations. Do precarity and assembly help us understand the protests in the United States during the summer of 2020? Butler and Staal assert a deep connection, even an identity, between the presence of bodies in public space, bodies that have in some sense been forced to assemble, who have no choice but to assemble, and the content of their politics. That precarious and vulnerable bodies have come together testifies to the ravages of neoliberalism and bodily expresses a demand for care. And this is particularly Butler's argument, and I disagree with this. Precarity does not name a politics. It names a feeling associated with a condition. That people come together in protest, to demonstrate, aggrieved and infuriated, doesn't tell us what their politics is. That comes from elsewhere, outside, from something beyond and irreducible to their gathering. We can call that outside history and truth. This is why protesters make signs, bring banners, wave flags, and display props testifying to their politics. Presence is not enough. It has to be made present, represented, named. And even then, the politics may not be clear, not immediately. Consider the assault on the US Congress on January 6th, 2021. Thousands of people stormed the Capitol to try to stop the certification of the 2020 presidential election. Most of the rioters had been at a Stop the Steal rally where President Donald Trump claimed to have won the election by a landslide. Just as he had been asserting for months, Trump said that the election had been stolen in, quote, "the most brazen and outrageous election theft, and there's never been anything like this, so pure theft in American history," end quote. In his over an hour-long speech, Trump ranted against weak Republicans, the Supreme Court, the media, quote, "We will not be intimidated into accepting the hoaxes and the lies we've been forced to believe," end quote. He told the assembled that they had gathered together, quote, "for one very, very basic and simple reason, to save our democracy," end quote. The election wasn't just stolen from him, it was stolen from the country, from them. Trump detailed numerous allegations of fraud and error and mysteriously lost ballots. Wrapping up the litany of complaints, he added, quote, "I could go on and on about this fraud that took place in every state, and all of these legislatures want this back. I don't want to do it to you because I love you, and it's freezing out here, but I could just go on forever," end quote. Love, endless grievance, stolen futures, the theft of their vote, their will, their choice. Trump embodied and performed the identity between his supporters, their view of their country, their democracy, and himself. Reports on those arrested at the Capitol arrested for the Capitol assault find that 60% had histories of financial problems, such as bankruptcy, tax liens, foreclosure, and eviction notification. Their bankruptcy rate was twice the American average. 20% had faced losing their home. Jenna Ryan, a 50-year-old woman from Texas with these same financial problems, charged into the Capitol shouting, "Fight for freedom, fight for freedom." Expert commentary on the motivations behind the assault on the Capitol identified people's feelings as being about more than just economic insecurity, but a deep feeling of precarity about their personal situation. Precarity combined with a sense of betrayal or anger that someone is taking something away mobilized many of the rioters. Butler's and Stahl's emphases on precarity don't enable us to distinguish between the vulnerability expressed in a fascist assembly and that expressed in a progressive one. Which side is the freedom side? The politics of gathering isn't simply from the gathering, it's from the political content that stimulated, led to, called for the gathering. Some element of political content, no matter how inchoate or incoherent, is necessary for the cohering. Focusing simply on the act of appearing erases that content. The role of organizers is to make it explicit. The role of the party is to make it communist. One might object that the assault on the US Capitol was not exactly an assembly. It was more an anti-assembly, an effort, momentarily successful, to block a legitimate assembly. This is not a strong objection. Thousands attended the Stop the Steal rally earlier that day. Thousands assembled outside major entrances to the Capitol building, remaining there for hours. These actions repeated the demonstrations outside and inside state capitals that had occurred throughout the summer in protest against COVID shutdowns and mask requirements. One might object that these COVID assemblies lacked a deliberative element and so again are not proper assemblies. A possible response could be that the right-wing social media enacts a distributed, extended form of deliberation. The actual gathering of bodies punctuates these online exchanges. But neither Butler nor Staal make deliberation a constitutive feature of assemblism, nor do they emphasize anything like a proper assembly. On the contrary, for both, the improper, unexpected gathering of bodies where they are not supposed to be, the insistence that these bodies announce, the disruption they effect is, quote, a direct expression of the condition of precarity and a protest against it, end quote. Gathering in protest against precarity describes actions. It doesn't name a politics. Precarity is less a site of alliance than it is the setting of conflict and contestation, a condition which people may be provoked to contest. Politics concerns the direction of the provocation, the terms of the contest, who and what is to blame. What is the crime and what must be changed? Who is called to be an agent of that change and what is necessary for people to hear and respond to the call? Grievance and loss, a sense of being disposable, replaceable, also don't name a politics. I add replaceable here because of the white supremacist demonstrations held in Charlottesville, Virginia during the summer of 2017. Various neo-Nazi and neo-Confederate groups gathered to protest the removal of Confederate monuments. At a nighttime rally with torches, they chanted, "You will not replace us," and "Jews will not replace us." Butler's analysis of resistance as the mobilization of vulnerability illuminates the structure of feeling of this assembly. Quote, when the bodies of those deemed disposable or ungrievable assemble in public view, they are saying, we have not slipped quietly into the shadows of public life. We have not become the glaring absence that structures your public life, end quote. Butler, of course, rejects fascist, racist, and anti-Semitic congregations. Yet her account of precarity, vulnerability, and assembly doesn't provide a means for drawing a line between some grievances and others. The senses of disposability, theft and loss we oppose, and those in whose name we fight. But only with the line, with the name, do we have a politics. Being in space, deliberate exposure and persistence is not enough. Politics involves the fight over the space and which side we are on. Staal and Butler suggest that bodies assembled in a public place enact or perform a politics that is prior to any explicit statement of demands. Presence is its own demand, especially once we recognize the vulnerability of bodies, what is needed to protect and secure exposed bodies, and so on. A limitation of this view is the implicit opposition between the bodies whose presence performs and prefigures a politics that is not spoken, which I've argued is not a politics at all, but a setting or condition for politics, and the specificity of the political demand. The opposition between demand and immediate bodily presence displaces histories of struggles onto site-specific practices, condensing fidelity to the truth of this history into demands, as if demands did not arise from the context and commitments that make them legible. Demands express a line, a division that makes them worth fighting for. To present the practices associated with assemblism as alternatives to or prior to demands obscures this division, in effect, evacuating politics from the scene in which it is said to appear. 10 years ago, in 2011, the global movement of the squares that extended from Tunisia, Egypt, Greece, and Spain into the Occupy movement appeared to have ushered in a new mode of politics, the occupation of public space for extended periods of time. It's interesting that in the US summer of 2020, this was not a primary form of protest on the left. Why? Oh, I add on the left for two reasons. First, because in the US, the occupation form hasn't been associated with right-wing demonstrations, in contrast to, for example, the 2013 Maidan protest in Ukraine. Second, because right and left protest in the US in 2020 generally had similar forms, rallies, car rallies, marches, riots, that often engaged and mirrored each other. And I'm going to talk a little bit more about that in a second. But what explains the absence of the occupation form of left, a relative absence of the occupation form of left assembling and protest in 2020? The COVID pandemic, being in stationary, close proximity with a large number of other bodies for an extended length of time might have just felt wrong. So maybe that's why it wasn't so strong. This is plausible, especially when you think about mask wearing, social distancing, and how hard it can be to hear people outside. I think, though, that a better explanation could be that Black Lives Matter has not made the occupation a primary form of protest, instead deploying rallies, vigils, die-ins, brunch disruptions, and marches that block intersections or go onto major freeways. Although some in the anarchist tradition disparage rallies and marches, poo-pooing the sign carriers as following passively behind leaders, street marches, especially unauthorized ones on major thoroughfares, these require exceptional courage. Demonstrators can be hit by cars, and sometimes they're deliberately hit by cars. That happened outside of Denver this summer in protest for Elijah McClain, another Black man killed by police. In the summer of 2020, the uprising of marches protesting the police murder of Black people frequently incorporate elements of collective care associated with occupations, providing food and water, hand sanitizer, masks, and having self-organized medics and security. Along with sit-ins and boycotts, marches for Black liberation in the US are also legible as part of the legacy of the civil rights movement. The Black Lives Matter and civil rights explanations require that we consider the substance of the protests, their larger history and truth as prior to their form. A third explanation for the absence of occupation and the primacy of marches in left demonstrations during the summer of 2020 continues the emphasis on history and amplifies the politics of truth. The protests were a revolt against racism and police murder, a mass mobilization against the fascism and white supremacy enacted daily through the police occupation of working class Black and brown neighborhoods. When they marched, demonstrators claimed social space by circulating through it without permission. They could also approach rally sites, such as police stations and city halls, from varying directions, perhaps evading police or, more often, engaging police at different locations, bringing the altercation to different neighborhoods. Because the marches were explicitly against the police, calling for the abolition of the police, the defunding of the police, and the jailing of killer cops because Black Lives Matter, the marches, no matter how peaceful, frequently generated violent police reaction: tear gas, tanks, pepper spray, rubber bullets, and the high-pitched wail of LRADs. The marches sometimes were met by armed and violent white supremacists not explicitly authorized by the state. In Kenosha, Wisconsin, one of these people shot and killed 2 protesters. Throughout the summer, Blue Lives Matter truck and motorcycle demonstrations circulated to counter the Black Lives Matter protests. Many of these demonstrations would feature Confederate flags, Nazi symbols, and insignia from white militias, along with the Blue Lives Matter flags. Throughout the summer, those people who assembled took a side. In taking a side, they took a stand for or against Black liberation from white supremacy and racist police violence, for or against the freedom of police to uphold a social order premised on terrorizing Black communities. When there are sides, what is necessary are shows of force and courage, performance of strength and endurance. Each side has its symbols or banners that place it in a history. Breonna Taylor, George Floyd. They have counter flags where names are the people's names countered the flags of the white supremacists. The fight isn't simply people against the state. It's a struggle over the state, that is, over the basic conditions of collective life and the direction we will push them. If we think of the assembly in terms of the General Assembly, people gathered in large circles to consider and deliberate, it's clear why this form doesn't appear as a primary feature of protest in the United States in 2020. It's inadequate to civil war. Thank you.
Well, thanks a lot, Jodi. And yes, it connects quite well to the last session we had, if you heard it, because we were talking a lot about assemblies, and actually some of the points that you were mentioning would also probably apply there. So you said that one thing, the focus on precarity is wrong, because precarity, as you say, doesn't name a politics, it names a feeling associated with the condition. And the other point in this regard was the fetishization of the assembly as a performative moment, as a moment that is political already itself. Maybe Jonas, because you were also directly quoted in this way, maybe you would want to react to that, what your view on these points is.
Yeah, I was making notes along the way. I mean, I think the point about indeed there's a kind of an immediate response can be a kind of technical discussion about what exactly constitutes an assembly, how spontaneous, at which point, and then of course it's always also important to acknowledge that that most processes described as performative assembly, they have origins. They have origins of students that organize with small groups, break down doors of universities so that people can sit in a circle there later on to discuss how to self-govern the place. But this initial moment of kicking down the door is often not considered as part of the assembly, but is inherent part of it, just as in the context of the Rojava Revolution, the autonomous government of Rojava, self-government through assembly is essential, but wouldn't exist without decades of struggles of the Kurdistan Workers' Party that was able to establish that was able to chase Assad from the territory in order for there to be a model based on local assembly. So the idea that the assembly or performative assembly is somehow spontaneous or would lack or stands separated from history, I would also not agree on. It certainly has a history, it builds on a history, and it's possible often because of a history of previous struggle, and that struggle does not necessarily have to be a progressive or emancipatory one. If we think of the examples that Jodi just mentioned in relationship to the Capitol riots, the history of the alt-right, how it is structured in the context of the US, in the history of paleoconservatism, of the militia movements. I mean, that stretches decades. They opened the door for this assembly to manifest in the form of the occupation of the capital. I think that in the case of Butler, of course, she speaks about assemblies that have a potential for emancipatory politics. I don't think that she denies that there is a pre-existing history that leads to that moment. I think she does recognize, and I do that too, that many people who join moments of performative assembly might not yet be completely aware of the histories that made it possible for them to appear, or the narratives of which they become part. There's also a process for many people of politicization through the assembly. I became a more politicized person once I was in Occupy than before, because the experience of collectivity and starting to challenge and question what that collectivity could bring also made me more aware of the history that I was part of, joining on the square. So, and I think yes, of course, we're driven, even in the case of the Occupy movement, we're driven by a common narrative of dispossession, the outcomes of a criminal mortgage system, the capitalist class in general. That's a narrative in the case of emancipatory examples of popular assemblies. But then there's still the consequence of this narrative is not always yet defined. I mean, if you think of the Petrograd women's protests that started or were a crucial point of the 1917 revolution, the demands to bring down the Tsar, the demand for bread. Yes, in some case that was done with the red banner in hand. But did that count for, was everyone joining that mass movement already fully aware of the politics that they were enabling, or was that politicization part of the process? And what were these mass protests not also a site of contestation of the kind of interpretation? Even if everyone would wave the red flag, there was still a contestation of what kind of politics that red flag would result into. So this, I think, is the crucial prefigurative dimension of performative assembly, of the popular mass movement, of crowd dynamics. The outcome of that is an outcome of struggle over the meaning of that form. So yes, it has a pre-existing history. That doesn't mean that everyone in the assembly, that appears in assembly, that appears in the popular mass movement, that appears in the crowds, is equally aware or shares equally the interpretation and the future of what that history should lead to at that specific moment. That is still part of the struggle. And maybe also a point in the case of Butler, when Jodi mentions why were there no circles in the case of the BLM protest, because it's a civil war, it's inadequate. I completely agree. But Butler mentions many forms of performative assembly, including the hunger strike, for example, that has, clear common motivations, a shared history, although the history between all the participants in the hunger strike might not be exactly the same. That come at a high cost, and don't follow the kind of liberal form of, let's put it more simple, not every form or morphology that Butler describes in the case of performative assembly is necessarily a liberal form in the way that the Occupy movement tended to produce this kind of liberal form of assembly. So the analysis that assemblies are actions and not a politics, or that they are analyzed as such by Butler, I don't think that I agree with that. I'm sorry that my response is a bit scrambled because I didn't read the text before. So this is just, I'm speaking as I was listening to you speak.
So yeah, I hope we can get into some of these details. So first, I find it strange to include, honestly, the hunger strike within assemblies. I think that starts to really expand, like any kind of politics any kind of resistance politics becomes lumped into assemblies. So that move on Butler's part, I just find really like strange. So that's first on the hunger strike thing. Second, so I think where the issue here is which aspect of the protest or of a protest moment are we emphasizing? So you agree, yes, with there's a history, okay. But then your move, Jonas, is to say not everyone. But my argument doesn't require everyone. I'm not talking about like every person who comes in. I'm interested in the organizers because I'm interested in the party here. And when it seems to me that when you say, well, maybe everyone wasn't fully aware and people change and blah, blah, blah. I don't mean blah, blah, blah dismissively. I mean like, et cetera, et cetera. That is ignoring, in my view, the role of the organizers who are pushing the struggle that's there, right? That's where the sides come in. You can't think about the struggle without articulating the sides. And then that means the folks organizing from a particular side. So the Petrograd women, yes, right? Like that was, coming out of their work in their unions, coming out of that particular, like, I guess it was like early International Women's Day, even before International Women's Day was official. But the Bolsheviks are able to push that over the next few months, right? So that's even why we think back of this as part of the specific Bolshevik revolution, right? Because of a side and because of the specificity of that political side. That we're not talking about the February Revolution from the standpoint of, the Tsar or the whites or even like peasant SRs, right? We think about it from the perspective of the red flag of the, of the Bolsheviks. I mean, you could conceivably, tell a story that's going to end with Kronstadt, but in fact, that's not the story that you're telling, right? Or in your example, right? It's anchored in the specificity of the Bolshevik side. And that's what I'm trying to bring out with this critique of the prefigurative dimension of assemblies. Like, I think that emphasis doesn't let us see the work of people who are making the decisions around chairs and benches, creating the spatial forms, like that kind of work, right? Doing the visuals. That I think of that as party work. And I loved your emphasis on the move from kind of a prefigurative art practice to organizational art practice. But like I love the Amazon campaign and the Facebook campaign. Both of those, we've got clear sides, right? We know who the enemy is, and we know who's being galvanized. I mean, that's to me one of the things that makes those particular projects so really powerful, politically and aesthetically.
Maybe before I just continue, I just wanted, because I forgot just to say it. So in this, to everybody out there, in this Vimeo, you cannot interact at the moment. So we will talk for a while, but there will be a Zoom link quite soon, and then you can join, and then we can have a discussion all together. I just forgot to mention this. But coming back to what you just said, I found it interesting. Jonas, you mentioned the yellow vests as an, let's say, an ambivalent movement in that regard. And in Germany, it was mainly portrayed very negatively. In France, I know for many people who have quite a different view on it. And in two editions, we'll have Didier Ribon here also is claiming that you have to see it as a leftist movement, despite what these things. But I find it quite interesting because you, Jodi, describe a situation in the US where, well, there's civil war and the sides are clear. So there's different kinds of ambivalences maybe, but they are on a very small, much smaller scale. They are not the big conflicts. And I'm a bit wondering, like, maybe if you could both, in line of your thoughts, talk about the possibilities of dissensus, the possibilities of an agonistic assembly or an agonistic movement. How much agonism can a movement have? How much finding out along the way can a movement have, or does it have already to be organized? Basically, this had to be before, and it's too late then to have it, and then everything has to fall in line somehow. So yeah, maybe because also, Jonas, you had in your assemblies, you have a certain agonistic situation, but of course within clear limits. I mean, let's say in the New World summits, for example, there are different positions, but they are, they are not maybe the most different ones. So yeah, so maybe you could tell a bit about the possibilities of the census or agonistic finding out together, maybe in a way.
Yeah, I mean, maybe first in relationship to the Yellow Vest movement, because I think that's a very interesting example also of that links back to Jodi's the quote that I mentioned of from Jodi's work on the fetishization of the kind of the spectacle of the gathering as an almost as an experiential rather than political moment. So what you could see with the Yellow Vests and the response amongst progressives was that everyone was waiting. In a way, waiting for the question, is it the good movement? Like, is it the movement that gives me liberal credits, or that gives me the legitimacy to experience this eventual moment, or not? But of course, what the reality of the Yellow Vest movements was that, yes, as Jodi mentioned, there were organizers, but there were many parallel organizers with very, very different agendas and different histories, sometimes fundamentally conflicting histories that they brought. My Kurdish comrades that joined in the Yellow Vest movements, they pushed for the movement for it to become a much more militant left event, or they were fighting for the narrative, just like the unions were fighting for the narrative. The left parties, the Communist Party in France was fighting over its narrative, just as the Rassemblement National of Marine Le Pen did it. So here I thought was a really crucial moment also to see that certain forms of popular mass movement, certain forms of performative assembly, it's part of it is a struggle over its form. It prefigurates something. It can have a potential. It brings various histories. Just as Jodi mentioned before, there were many different factions that were active in parallel during the 1917 revolution. And it was also a struggle within who would come to write the narrative, or who would come to structure the discharge of the crowd into a form of structural governance, of enforcing or establishing a new regime of power. So it's a space of contestation. The fact that there are organizers doesn't mean that there are still not various different conflicting prefigurations manifesting in the mass movement, and that there's a struggle over its final meaning or form. In relationship to the question of, so I think there is agonism, there's antagonism, and of course it's also true that it's difficult to talk about these different examples and suggesting that they're somehow, because there are bodies assembling on a space, that we can just generically compare one to the other, like the histories that lead to them, the level at which a political narrative is already pre-established or still in the making is also really different in different geographies and in different political contexts. If you ask me the question about agonism, antagonism in my own work and the role of assembly, meaning of bodies gathering in a space in the New World Summit, for example, I mean, these are pre-organized, like they are organized moments that are trying to enforce sides. So the New World Summit that Jodi also participated in, or one of the editions she participated in, I mean, they are aimed at establishing a new us in another kind of us versus them divide. That's what they're organized to do. They're organized to establish a different side in relationship to the war on terror, for example.
Jonas, when you're talking about the Yellow Vest, and you're saying that with these different groups, they're struggling over its form, it actually seemed to me like they were struggling over its content, right? Like which narrative was going to be the primary issue, right? Was this a more of a right-wing or a left-wing kind of movement? That seems like that's a content. No one's saying, my God, we need to wear different vests, right? Or let's stop gathering, or let's only occupy buildings, right? It was a struggle over the content.
Absolutely. And when I say, but maybe this is indeed I could have made this more precise, but when I say form or social form, or at least the way that I understand also Butler's use of social form, that's not a form in the sense of a purely formal visual appearance. It's not a question merely of symbols. It's about a form of life. It's about relationality. It's about a form of governance, of decision making, of sharing power or transferring power or redistributing power. Form for me it relates to the infrastructures and organizational models that we desire or fight over or fight for. Yeah. So, when I speak of morphology specifically, then I mean a genealogy of visual forms. But these obviously, these are maybe that was the confusion over the term.
So, right, if I think right now about the United States in the summer of 2020, and this is still ongoing. I mean, it's not like it's over. There is a massive set of struggles going on over the form of life, and it's not one movement, right? It's civil war. And to talk about dissensus, no offense, Florian, but just to my mind, that's just like just seems so liberal. Like my partner would say we'd be lucky to have liberalism, right? It would be nice to be able to have enough of an agreement to be able to communicate with one another in a common assembly. But I think that the assault on the Capitol was a clear indication that it's gotten so bad that we lack that. And that I was just seeing today in one of the newspapers that members of Congress are refusing to interact with one another, right, in the same elevators with one another. Multiple members of Congress refuse to get vaccinated. They are essentially repeating lies about the election and about January 6th. And so the conditions of possibility for dissensus aren't there, which is some version of an underlying agreement. So when with civil war, division goes all the way down, and that's the condition that where we are right now. And so then if we go back to the kinds of assemblies that Jonas puts together, that you're creating a space for bodies to deliberately come together, I think means that there's some supposition of an underpinning of consensus at some point for it to even be possible. That your assemblies work because they're not positing civil war, right? They posit rather than a division that's going all the way down. Like you just said, we're trying to create a new us or a new constellation, but it's not trying to eliminate or disavow the underlying division, right? It's trying to maybe create a new us, but I don't think it's the same thing as disavowing the division. And if that's the case, then highlighting the division that makes it possible, in my view, is important. And that's why I advocate, a language of communism, the Communist Party form, one that makes very clear that this is not a liberal, everyone's included, blah, blah, blah. There's a fundamental division here at stake.
And Jodi, I mean, I from the distance, I totally agree that it looks like in the US, it's beyond dissensus and it's beyond agonism. It's an antagonistic situation, which the question is if it can be reversed ever, or what will it will lead to. But I mean, I find it interesting when we look at the Yellow Vests, or I mean, also at the situation at Tahrir Square or whatever, where very opposing liberal artists and religious Orthodox and so on were all on one square. So it's and there are several examples of this. I wonder, first of all, I would be interested, do you say there was a situation in the US ever where in one movement, before it was defined, or where the struggle around narration was still happening, that all these people met in one movement, or is this division already so far that is rooted so far that this is not there anymore? But the other question also, like in this situation, I mean, like in Tahrir Square, or it's very different, but in Yellow Vests, but in these movements, how can this multiplicity of very opposing views in there, what is the what's the task of organizing? What is the task of winning the narration in this to make it a productive movement? Or is it already from an early moment on to say, like, listen, we have nothing in common. You go this way, we go this way. Or is there a moment where the idea of using this crowd as a mass and keeping it together as long as possible and maybe shifting it into a certain narration can be of use?
I think that the latter part of your question makes most sense as towards Jonas. In the United States, I think because of the history as being a slave society and apartheid society, that the division is really fundamental. I mean, it's not like it's the case like, okay, let's make sure we can have an alliance between the left and the Ku Klux Klan. Or the communist and slave owners, right? That's not even a goal. Like, no, like there's no. I mean, there are sites of different where there are other kinds of smaller divisions, right? You can say like whether or not the small store owners are going to side with big capital, or whether or not they're going to side with labor. I mean, that's you see that in lots of different modern societies, even including in the U.S. But that's not the kind of sort of movement politics I think we're talking about. And I think at the and to my mind, this is not a problem, right? This is a good thing. The clarity of the division makes then the galvanizing of the struggle all the more powerful and plausible, right? You can tell people which side that you're on.
But how would you view, for example, what would be your view on the yellow vests?
I've got to say, honestly, I don't want to make a call, because it would be, if I were there, I would have been, in there with a hammer and sickle on my back. And I really like the way that's that double insignia to say, okay, we're in the yellow vest movement, then we have a particular orientation within that movement. Right? That strikes me as completely smart and really great. It made me think also of how Jonas is bringing the Russian constructivism to get together with the Ammonites. I mean, it's fantastic, right? It's like, here's not just a symbol of a kind of sort of non-politically clear natural history. It's a symbol of a red natural history, one that is taking a side, right? When you say fossils are comrades, not fuels, right? That's a really, really specific, I love that slogan. It's just wonderful, right? That's a specific politics, and it's intervening because like ecological and environmental politics, that's also all over the place. That's not one thing. That would be a site where there's all sorts of different elements, different kinds of political opportunities, different political sides, different political groupings, affiliations, interest. And I think Jonas's work there is actually making a very, very explicit political intervention in a field, where one can, right? Where it's not clear. It's not this amorphous, spontaneous thing. It's like, here's this one specific politics.
But do you think, Jodi? Oh, sorry.
If you want to.
Yeah, I mean, do you think that? I mean, in your work, you also describe the history. I mean, you speak of the history of communism as a dynamic history. Vijay Prasad refers to it as a polycentric communism. Isn't the history of communism also a struggle over the meaning of communism?
Yes.
So when we speak of the need of division, that happens on various levels, in the sense that if you and me agree on the division between a society that is based on private property and theft and extraction, and a society that is based on commonly held means of production and a dismantling of private property, we might still be facing another level of division in terms of the infrastructures and forms that would bring that process about. Just, I feel that's also part of the history of communism that you have written, the struggle over what it means. Then we know that we're on the same side, but that still leaves a whole set of questions of prefiguration and form over what it will mean.
and to my, I don't disagree with anything you've said, Jonas, on that, right? And so at that point, sorry,
another comrade,
non-human. At that point, this is where the party form, for me, becomes absolutely crucial, because it's from within a party that where basically at the end of the day, the decision of what, which side, what line, who are your comrades. And so for the most part, like everything that you outlined, like where you and I agree, let's say, abolition of private property, the problems of capitalism, et cetera. Yeah, we are comrades on all of those things. There could be some other specific questions. I don't want to look for them, where in fact we might disagree. And the question would be like, to what extent are our disagreements on, let's say, some very specific political questions? Do they make us no longer be comrades, to make us no longer be on the same side? Or are there ones that, no, this is not crucial, right? I don't have to agree with my comrades about every single thing. It depends on what the struggle is and what the kind of, the conditions of belonging that we're part of. Or you might say our form of life, or our form of being together. And the party is one of those forms of being together. So it's like there are forms that we inhabit that in some way, let's say, put a stop to the endless processing of division, and saying, okay, this is where we collectively have made our decision to say, these are the fights that matter, these are the points of agreement that matter. I'm not sure if I said that very clearly.
No, it makes sense, but sorry.
No, I wonder, because in a way, yes, I mean, one can imagine what you mean. On the other hand, of course, the line between where you say, okay, we need a clear division on these points, and on the other hand, you argue against partialization and a certain claim of identity and so on as counterproductive, or even destroying this. So where's the line between where we say, here it's good to say we are on this side, you're on this side, and where is it actually saying, I know, but we have enough common ground, as even so you said common ground is difficult to find at the moment, but that would be the moment. So I mean, and that's, I mean, the Yellow Vest also had a common goal, at least to a degree. At certain moments, it's difficult to say. So there was enough common ground felt to be together for a moment on the streets, but then it came to limits. But maybe I would just we can maybe go back to this later on, even so, or take it another way. I mean, maybe the question of where it gets too commentalized, too partialized in a way. The question of the role of identity in this, it would be, you can, for example, when you introduce the figure of the comrade, you also address this problem, Jodi, and Jonas, you also with your assemblies experience moments of limits of being able to assemble assemblies that were basically ended because the disagreement was too strong, or certain agendas were seen as more important than others. So maybe you could say something to the limits or the potential of assemblies for this backdrop in a way.
I'll just say something very quick, because I'm really interested in hearing about like where some of the Jonas's assemblies ended. Like I don't know those stories. I'm interested in that. From my perspective, identity doesn't name a politics, right? That someone has a set of ascriptive identities or ascribes identities to themselves does not tell us anything about their politics, right? I mean, in fact, it seems quite clear at this point that a right-wing amplification of the politics of identity is crucial to the way that the fascist backlash and the rise of fascism is occurring right now in across the world, really. So I think identity just doesn't tell us very much about politics. So the far right wants us to think that it does, but part of building a much stronger international working class, understanding class and working class in a broad sense. The left is actually keeping to point out the limits of these forms of ascriptive identity. But I'd rather hear about how that messed up Jonas's, or not messed up, I mean, but how it created conflict in some of your assemblies.
I mean, of course, in the case of the New World Summit, we work with stateless and blacklisted organizations over the course of the development of the summit that had a strong focus on stateless and blacklisted organizations that stem from a long history of anti-colonial liberational struggle, but that still doesn't, being blacklisted doesn't mean that you agree simply because you're sharing a similar condition of oppression or denial. So we've had representatives who claimed a right to self-determination or indigeneity to overlapping territories. I mean, that's a pretty. Then, of course, the question is that does that necessarily have to be a problem, and can also in a space that borders between political reality and artistic imagination, can it also opt or push other notions of parallel sovereignties, of overlapping or parallel forms of statehood? I also feel that that it's important to see, in a way, in certain conflicts, there are also prefigurations of models of governance that go beyond the models in which we think at present. And I think that's an important role that art plays in the process. This is a prefigurative role that art plays in the process. For example, while I was listening to you now, Jodi, I was thinking two things. One is indeed what you explain as the structure of the party. If I think of it in the Roosevelt context, it's the structure of the social contract. The social contract says certain things, and that there is a self-organized army that elects its commanders. That this people's army is tied to gender quotas. That it counts for the assemblies as well. That there is a percentual representation of Assyrians and Kurds and Arabs from the region, etc., etc. And these are not contested. That means contesting these means that you are banned from the right to participate. That communal economy is central. No one has the right to challenge the fact that communal economy is central to the Roosevelt Revolution. Then we can have a fierce discussion about how do we organize communal economy in a way, how do we organize gender equality in a way that matters. And here I think is where that's the space where comradeship can exist with certain divisions or conflicts. That was one thing I was thinking. And the second was the last image that I showed of the proletarian plans is an amazing fragment from a poster that I found from a Chinese propaganda archive. I still haven't dated it exactly, but I'm quite sure it belongs to one of the several year plans for collectivization. And of course, it's super interesting that image represents two things. It affirms the need for collectivization. And at the same time, it does something that is completely counter to its industrial logics by proclaiming not the heroic human peasant as the kind of struggling proletarian, but the plant itself as the struggling proletarian. So the artistic component in that poster affirms the need of the present, and at the same time, it's already prefiguring something of the future. The environmental crisis that would be inherent to the collectivization, or let's say the industrialist collectivization effort, in a very similar way that Alexander Bogdanov in his Red Mars science fiction novel from 1906 was supporting collectivization and already prefiguring its limits in terms of environmental exhaustion. So it's also very interesting that within the common ground of comradeship, there can also already be prefigurations that also conflict with it, or that support it and conflict with it at the same time.
I think that sounds fantastic. I as in wonderful and great, and it makes me think about the ways that the seeds of the future are always in the present, right? The fact that capitalism produces its contradictions, not just in a negative, destructive way, but in a positive way. That in fact, in the history of Marxist-Leninist thought, it's never been a kind of closed box of determinism, but there's been forms of opening and forms of change and shift, right? This is like, it's dialectics. And in too much kind of postmodern influenced late 20th century thought, and tried to make dialectics a bad word. But I would say that the phenomenon that you've analyzed so beautifully with the proletarian plant is a great example of the kind of wonders of Marxist-Leninist thought in a really broad sense, and it helps retrieve it from the kinds of stultifying Cold War, anti-communist, anti-colonial forms of thought that have tried to restrict it. And so that really, I mean, maybe I react to prefiguration as a term that tends to be like on an anti-communist side, but really it's just another word for dialectics, right? For finding the seeds or creating or finding the spaces that are already part of the present or part of a new future in the present.
Maybe before we open up and we continue in a more informal way with whoever wants to join us, something that already came up and we were also a bit leading to it now, to ask for the role of art in this and the role. I mean, at some moment I thought like also some of the questions are actually badly translated into art context, would be the famous discussion between content and form. So what is the form without the content? On the other hand, you, Jonas, stress, of course, the form. For example, also with very concrete examples when you mention the bench instead of the chairs in an assembly. So and assemblism, as you said, is also the role of art within these movements, within assemblies, within these struggles. So while I think there's a lot to be said, said already about the role of art and in mass movements, in assemblies, and so on, I wonder maybe if you both could react to this to the end, like about the role of art in a party or for building a party. Jonas, you already in the end was a bit mentioning this in your talk, but if you could maybe say something about the role of art in this process of founding a party, of becoming sustainable, of finding different ways of organizations.
Yeah, I'm sorry. I'm trying to compute several thoughts throughout at the same time, and one is that that the parliaments that we work with and the analysis that I shared with you about how certain forms might contribute to furthering emancipatory ideology, but also try to translate them in the process. So the way that artistic imagination and political imagination might have slightly different competences, but create each other's conditions of emergence in a way. This for me is a guiding line. Without an emancipatory politics, there's no emancipatory art, but it goes into two directions. Of course, that doesn't mean that a form is never something in and of itself. Like you can make a beautiful circular parliament with benches, but as long as it operates in a society based on private property and extraction and structural institutional racism, and you name it, then it just masks. And that's of course a task that art has had throughout history, to mask the violence, or to, as Rousseau put it, to fling flowers on the shackles that weigh us down. I mean, this has been historically an important role of art to legitimize ruling powers. As Hito Steyerl says it, to make capitalism more beautiful seems to be the predominant role that art plays in contemporary society. So I don't believe that the form can never exist without a political context, without the content, as Jodi put it, and the practice and its application. But nonetheless, I do think that certain forms can further emancipatory ideology and practice further or better, or prefigure more possibilities coming from them. The example of the proletarian plants was one that I shared with you now. But when I read Jodi's work, and I've done it for quite some time, I mean, not only does she push my own political imagination, and also I think what is very important in Jodi's work is that she has contributed enormously to undoing the propaganda of fear for the possibility of an alternative. So the fear that has been installed with us when someone dares to utter the word communism, because communism means gulag, means violence, means centralized power, means completely undoing this polycentric or dynamic history of communism, but also in a way making a taboo of our own collective desire for collectivity, limiting the political imagination and thus also an imagination of form. Because that's the second part that comes with reading her work, is that I'm always reading while thinking of form. Yes, I want to be I want to join that party. But what is the form of that party? Is the proletarian plant our guiding banner? What are our slogans? Are we demanding for a better future for the children of our children, or are we demanding 1 million more years? Because when we stand with our Ammonite comrades, so to say, what we learn from that deep, being part of that deep ecology or deep ecology of comradeship, is that we can begin to start dialoguing and thinking across millions of years instead of this extremely reduced presence that liberal politics has placed upon us. Yes. So I think that this is an important role that artistic competence plays. It doesn't have a meaning in and of itself. The form in and of itself does not say much. But as part of a political movement, as part of a popular mass movement, as part of the party or the transnational party, the terrestrial party, the planetary party, the interplanetary party, it plays a role in pushing the potential agencies and forms and prefigurations of a communism for the 21st century.
I love everything Jonas just said. I thought was fantastic. In particularly the pushing the imagination, being able to see and think, to open up seeing and thinking and imagining is, utterly crucial. And so I really hate any of my answers to the question because they're too limiting. They're limiting, and so I'm glad we have artists who can tear them up, can open up other things. So just from within the standpoint of a party, I mean, like when writing, say, party material, it's wonderful to be able to find artistic examples. Let's say examples from, now I'm thinking of novels or poems or songs to help translate ideas. I don't think, I'm reluctant to say this because I don't want to reduce art to something that's, that's instrumentalized or translated, but that is a super useful part of what artists can do and do actually do, is help organizers translate ideas, help organizers transmit ideas, help organizers circulate ideas, even as they provide new ideas. So I think that element of, I'm going to use an example. This isn't even about a party, but about art and politics. The dance that I guess it came from Colombia in Latin America, a rapist, it was either Colombia or Mexico, I think, a rapist in your path. And women all over the world have been doing that dance as a way of contesting violence against women and the extent of that violence throughout, from the domestic sphere throughout the state. And so here's a way that the artistic form of this dance has opened up politics and let there be new bodily experiences of collectivity and power that were not there absent that new creation, right? I mean, yes, people have organized and blah blah blah, but here was like something that created something new and important and empowering for millions and millions of women all over the world. And so I think that's one very concrete example of one of the ways that the artistic imagination impacts politics by demonstrating and embodying the collective desire for collectivity.
Thank you, Jodi, for these perfect last words of this session, and thanks, Jodi and Jonas, for being here tonight and for your thoughts and for this very lively discussion. And there's a lot we can follow up in future editions. So I would like to mention that on April 10th, Art and Assembly, the fourth part will happen under the title Choirs of Precarity and Power. And we will look at the specific format of choirs as assemblies, but also choirs within assemblies. And my guest will be theater director Claudia Bosse from Vienna, art historian Alia Mossalam from Cairo, and the activists of the Church of Stop Shopping from New York City. And on May 20th, we hope to actually come together physically and analog in Vienna in the frame of Wiener Festwochen, but there will be also a live stream again and a podcast afterwards. And I will talk with Didier Ribon and Chantal Mouffe about agonistic gatherings. Thanks everybody for listening, and I hope you will join us again.